This is why ethics matter. So welcome to the showcase. I'm Duane Pohlman. I'm an investigative reporter with Spotlight on America. I'm a chief investigative reporter at WKRC TV. I'm a co-founder and president of the Ohio Center for Journalism, and I chair the SPJ Professional Standards and Ethics Committee. Now, before I introduce our esteemed guests, I want to go over some things that will be helpful, hopefully, to the audience. You can ask questions. Those questions you can type in at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. Don't type them in the chat, please. Type them in Q&A. I'll monitor your questions, and then, of course, I'll ask it throughout the program, some of the questions that are happening here. And then at the end of the program, we're hoping to have enough time to get to most of your questions, and I'm sure the panel would love to hear from you. This is, of course, SPJ Ethics Week, and with the Code of Ethics at the center of what we do, SPJ has been and will continue always to be the focus of ethics in journalism. We are a leader in that discussion, and we're proud to be. And tonight is a focused talk. We're pleased, as I said, to be joined by some of the best in journalism for a discussion here of ethics and the challenges, of course, we face in today's environment, the media world. Joining us very soon here is Sara Sidner. Sara is a multiple award-winning CNN senior national correspondent. She's covered the world, and she's part of the team that won a Peabody for CNN's coverage of the Arab Spring. Her posts with CNN include Jerusalem, Abu Dhabi, and New Delhi. Here at home, Sara has covered extensively both the George Floyd case in Minneapolis and the protests and the trial protests in Ferguson, Missouri for after the unarmed Black teen was shot and killed by a white officer. Sara is now based in Los Angeles. She continues her work as a correspondent and hosts a daily in-depth show on CNN's streaming platform, CNN Plus, called Big Picture with Sara Sidner. And as soon as Sara can get in, we'll be talking to her. Tom Rosenstiel is here. And I have heard Tom Rosenstiel's name so long as a journalist. And it's the first time I've actually talked to him. He's widely considered one of the most recognized thinkers in the country on the future of news and the intersection of media and politics. Currently, Tom is the Eleanor Merrill Visiting Professor of the Future of News at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. He's a non-resident senior fellow as well at the Brookings Institute. In his career, Tom has served as executive director of the American Press Institute for years. He was the founder and director of a very important thing, the Project for Excellence in Journalism, and co-founder and vice chair of the Committee of Concerned Journalists. Tom is the author as well of 11 books, including 4 novels, and I think he never sleeps. And then obviously we have Israel Balderas, licensed attorney, assistant professor of journalism at Elon University, where his teaching and research is focused on First Amendment and media law. Israel is an SPJ National Board member, chair of the SPJ Legal Defense Fund Committee. Prior to 2017, Israel was one of us. He was on TV as a news anchor and reporter in West Palm Beach. He's been in Charlotte, El Paso, and he was also a segment and line producer for Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace and Special Report with Britt Hume. Welcome to all of you. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So it's difficult to answer questions about ethics in a brief manner. I think we can all agree on that. But for the purposes of what we're doing here tonight to cover the breadth and depth of some of the issues and get around to all of the discussion, try to keep your answers to around 1.5 to 2 minutes. I know that's sometimes impossible. I'm not timing you, just try to keep them brief. For the audience, again, questions in the Q&A. I'll ask those questions as much as I can. Let's begin with what we're talking about here tonight. We're talking about why ethics matter. I'm going to start with you, Tom. Why in today's world do ethics matter in journalism?
I think ethics are baked into every decision we make. What stories we decide to cover, who we decide to interview and identify as sources, who we identify as experts, the way we frame stories, We don't think of that sometimes as ethics. There can be a tendency to, put ethics in a kind of corner, or we have an ethics week, and that's the week we think about ethics. But I think that they're baked into basically all the decisions we make. In one of the books I did called The Elements of Journalism, we don't have a chapter on ethics. Every chapter is basically about ethics.
So, and that leads it into Israel. I want you to kind of, you've been on all sorts of, just like Tom, on all facets of journalism, but in your case, you have TV. So I do TV. So it's a bit different how we look at ethics, but I want you to give that take along with being a licensed practicing attorney and how that melds with your understanding, sir.
Sure. I mean, when you talk about ethics, we're talking about a rational way of deciding what is good, right, for individuals or society. So, for example, an attorney has an ethical obligation to make sure that his or her client gets the best defense possible, whether or not the person is guilty or not guilty. That, right, in our society, in our rule of law, that attorney would defend the client against government prosecution, right? When we're talking about morals and ethics, we're talking about an individual's code of behavior, right? Based on something that you believe in. Maybe it's the way you were raised, maybe it's your ethnicity, maybe it's your religious background. So those two components of both ethics and morality inform us of what we should do. Right. And as journalists in our society, we sort of adhere to the Spider-Man principle, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Of course, that was Voltaire. It wasn't Spider-Man. But to my young audience, they understand that principle. And so therefore, as journalists, we have an ethical obligation to make sure that when we are reporting, we adhere to certain ethics and principles. For us, it's the SPJ Code of Ethics. But that's what guides us to determine what we should do, how we should report, what are the stories that we need to cover, and then how do we come across on TV or in newspaper to make sure that what we report is trustworthy.
So it's for those, I think everybody knows the code of ethics involves seeking the truth, reporting it, minimizing harm, which is a key part of this, act independently and be accountable and transparent. Sara, thank God we got you here. Thank you so much. I gave you such a nice introduction. I had to come outside.
I know this looks like I'm at a cabana in some fabulous place, but I'm actually on the street of New York because I think the problem was our internet wasn't working where I was. So now I'm good.
Thank you so much for being here. I
so
had a
sorry.
great introduction. You missed it, but that's okay. It's actually the start of it. So I did the basic question. So I'll ask you, Sara,
okay.
Why do ethics matter in what you do? And with all of you, what you've done.
There's so many reasons why ethics matter, especially now because of the enormous amount of disinformation that is permeating so many places, and it's not just on the internet, and it's not just social media. It's permeating other sometimes very well thought of organizations, and so I think part of the due diligence of ethics is to make sure, like you said, I do believe sort of in the doctor's creed, do no harm, when it comes to telling the truth of a situation. If the truth is harmful to someone because they are doing something that is harming society, then the truth affects a lot more people. But I do think the way in which that we go about telling stories, we have a code. We say that something is off the record, right? If you say that to someone, their understanding is that it will not go into a publication. It will not end up coming out of my mouth when I am reporting a story, or showing up in some other form of mass communication. And if you can't keep those promises, then you are probably over time either going to be shunned by most contacts, or you're going to become known as somebody who burns people. And there are times when you have to call someone up and say, look, I really need to use this information. How can I go about confirming this on the record? So I think it is a matter of really putting yourself in a position where you're trustworthy. And if you're not trustworthy, and I don't just mean with the people that you deal with, but I mean with the audience or the readership, then what is your worth really to the world of journalism if people really can't trust what's coming out of your mouth?
Yeah, and I see Tom writing down some things about that. Do you want to weigh in, Tom, on that? Did you have a thought?
Well, I just, to accent Sarah's well-made point that these things matter now more than ever. I think the question of trust in journalism or in any other institution comes down to a question of motivation, right? Trust is not a thing you can easily measure. If you survey about it, you don't really know what people mean. I think it really is a metric that is sort of the sum of all the things you do. Do I think you're well intended? And in this day and age, journalists need to stand out, and simply being transparent and saying, here's, we do this and we do that is not enough. People need to think, I think you're in it for the right reasons. And, and the best way to do that is to talk about your ethics.
Well, that's the transparency to show the audience too, a glimpse of even when you get it wrong, to say you got it wrong and to own it. Sara, I want to move to you, and I don't want to pick on you at all. I want
I allow you to pick on me. It is not unethical. I was the one that was late, so I give you all permission to pick on me. I'm getting away from the street so you can actually hear me.
I'll try to resist the temptation to go too far. Thank you. Sara, you know, one of the things that's really interesting for all of us is how news is perceived. You're with CNN, and CNN was ground zero for President Trump's attacks, which linger to this day as fake news, et cetera, et cetera. In reality, and we'll get to this a little bit later as well, in reality, all news has shifted away from what used to be a middle ground of total objectivity. In other words, there's editorial content, there's editorial discussion, and et cetera. By the way, for the record, I'm a big fan of yours. I've watched what you do. You're amazing. You stay right down the middle no matter what. And I think you're one of the best. And I don't say that lightly. You're amazing on how you handle these complicated issues, these incredible issues, and you were at the forefront of it. But how do you maintain your personal ethic within that noisy environment where you're getting screamed at as fake news and all of that? There's a temptation to react, but how do you handle that?
I think my upbringing helps me handle it. I come from a mixed race family. Issues have always come up within my family and within the community in which I grew up. And so I'm sort of used to having difficult conversations and knowing that if I react and am defensive or am rude back or, you know, start having an argument with somebody, there really is no winning. You're not going to win the person over by trying to negate what they believe and what they are, you know, are screaming at you. What I try to do is, and I'll use the example of, you know, what happened once in the field, and we get screamed at, by the way, from two sides of the aisle, believe it or not. During protests, I would often get screamed at from people on the political left and who did not like, for example, they would say, oh, mainstream media is telling lies, and then we'd get the other side of it saying that we are siding with the protesters every time. And so it's really an interesting dichotomy that I don't think a lot of people realize, that we are often targeted by a lot of people, because if they don't want certain information out, even if, by the way, that information is true, then you become a target. But the way that I have always handled it is, if it's in person and it's up close and personal, I let my guard down and I say to them, hi, my name is Sara. I am a human being just like you. Let's have a conversation. Obviously, when I'm not live. But I try and bring it down to a personal level so that I can try and talk to the person, listen to their concerns, and eventually, if you have time, you can have a longer conversation. If they don't want to have a conversation, I'll say, okay, clearly you don't want to hear anything I have to say, and that's okay. But I can't stand here and have this battle with myself. So I'm going to move on, and I kind of walk away from it. I do think it's important that we engage and not demonize people, even when they're demonizing you, because I feel like it's just a vicious circle of screaming at one another, and nobody's listening at some point. And it's hard to do sometimes. You have to calm yourself down on an emotional level, not to get riled up. But I think often journalists are trained to do that, especially if you are live a lot in chaotic situations. Your sort of brain is trained to calm down when things are crazy, and sort of bring things down to a level so that you are not making it chaotic for the audience, so that they can see what's going on around you, but you can remain kind of in control of what it is you're saying and doing. But I think that the key to all this really is conversations and not looking down your nose at people who disagree with something. I do have conversations where people talk about CNN said this or CNN said that, and they do that with everything. The New York Times said this, whoever had the content. And often what you will hear, it will be from somebody like an analyst or a pundit, especially in politics. And I try to keep up with who's saying what, and watch a lot of our air, watch a lot of the air of all of the other networks, because I kind of want to keep a sense of when someone says that, I'm like, oh, I know who said that. That was such and such analyst. That person, it may not matter to you, but is as an analyst, somebody who comes from a direction or comes from a side. And the reporting of that, the reporter that was on actually told both sides of the story. But it is a difficult conversation, I will be honest with you, because I think what's happened is everyone has just decided that if you say it as a network, or if it's said on your network, then that is what the network believes. And that's, I think, where it's become really, really difficult, especially in the field.
So I'm going to go to Israel next, but just real quickly, does it also make you feel, Sara, that you have to do even more to show that you're very fair about things does it double you down into the commitment of ethics and fairness?
Yeah, I think it does. But I don't think it's affected my reporting so much as it's affected my awareness of what is going to come at me, and to be prepared for that. Because I always try and be fair, and I there is objective, and I have crossed the line sometimes when I'm experiencing something that is so incredible, or that is so, I have stopped pretending like I'm a robot standing out there and not being affected by it. And there were some things that happened on the air. I had a moment where I just couldn't contain myself after going into a hospital where there were just people everywhere. And it really showed me how close we were to having a complete meltdown of our healthcare system during the early stages of COVID. And I was watching people dying, and people who were, just piled up, like up and down the hallways. There weren't enough rooms, there weren't enough beds. And it really rattled me. And I didn't even realize how much until I went on the air. And you watch that, and even I did. I cringed. I was so embarrassed when I cried on the air. But in the end, it was a more honest report, even though it wasn't, objective in the sense that I think of objectivity.
No, that's really interesting. Israel, Sara talked about her background, helping her and bringing forth some of the truth that she's able, and allowing herself to handle some of the criticism. Is there an advantage here in terms of your own background and not ignoring it as we have in the past, trying to tuck that away and say, oh, objective. How does that mesh with even the legal landscape, which requires, that kind of analysis? And certainly there's a big debate about this, and I'll go to Tom after this, but what do you have to, I mean, you've got to be thinking all kinds of things. What do you want to say?
Sure. First of all, I want to say I saw Sara break down in that coronavirus report. And I saw it live. And if I may, if it's okay, Sara, if I could share my screen, because I actually have that here with me.
Oh gosh.
And you know, Sara saw this as not my proudest moment as a reporter. I disagree. I think that for a journalist was the proudest moment because she was very human, right? She showed the audience what it feels, right? The truth. She reported the truth of going into the hospital, seeing the anguish, seeing what families were going through. And when you look at our code of ethics, right, to be accountable and to be transparent, I would argue that Sara was being the most ethical because she was telling people this is the truth. Now, she said, you know, I wasn't being objective the way she sees it. And again, I'm not going to steal Tom's thunder because I preach right from his book, right? I mean, I'm a disciple of elements of journalism. But I would say this, right? Objectivity is not who we are. Objectivity is what we do, right? We pursue the truth like a scientific method of approaching the truth. So to me, when I saw Sara, I saw an ethical journalist reporting the truth of what it is like to be in that hospital. And so to me, I would say to reporters like Sara or to others, it's okay to be human because the people we're talking to, they understand that, right? That's the truth. And I think reporters need to have a good understanding of what it means to be truthful and transparent. To be human is to be transparent.
Really good points all the way around. Tom?
Yeah, well, so yes, I've written about objectivity at length for many, many years. And the first point is objectivity is not neutrality. It is, as Israel said, it comes from social science, and it's the concept that I have used an objective method, a method that I can share with you so you can judge for yourself whether this information is reliable. It is the original call for it was to bring a more scientific spirit to journalism. There's a whole lot of literature here, and particularly in history and historiography and philosophy. And just 2 points. One, in some of that really detailed academic writing about objectivity, the objective method starts with identifying where your personal view is. Where are you coming from? Because you can't, that's the first step in trying to broaden your view beyond your own prejudice. We get a lot of background noise here.
Forgive me, I'm going to mute myself.
Gotcha. The second point is when we think of journalism, you know, in that sort of most traditional sense, Walter Cronkite, that's the way it is. The moments we remember best from Cronkite was when he was doing exactly what Sara did. When he takes his glasses off when we reach the moon and says, wow. And when Kennedy died. And they were all the more meaningful because this was not a guy, this was a guy who led with facts.
Well, I think it's important to understand, and I'm going to follow up with you, Tom, on that. It's important to understand the definition of objectivity while you talk about aptly, and you could talk forever about, you know, the scientific underpinning and the new science that's emerging, that objectivity is really not an attainable thing. At the core of it is not being influenced. This is the definition, not being influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. As a very, very specific thing, objectivity is not a bad goal, I don't think. This is my personal opinion. I don't think it's a bad goal. It's just about, you know, where it was taken in terms of eliminate all emotion and etc. So I guess the question for you, Tom, and we can take this around, is objectivity dead as we've known it since 1950s, or are we re-envisioning the attacks on objectivity and seeing it as fairness? And I'll make one caveat as you think about the answer. Broadcasters see fairness and objectivity different than print reporters, because we're under the FEC fairness, where it's equal time. And that's where it gets confused on the discussion. I'll let you answer. Stop talking now.
Well, so first of all, I mean, objectivity is a lousy term, and we didn't come up with it. It came out of German social science. And one of the reasons it's a crummy term is because in another context, the antonym of objectivity is subjectivity. And so if you are objective, you are not subjective. Well, that's not really the meaning that we apply to the idea of an objective method. You use an objective method, and the idea of objectivity came into journalism in the 1920s when there was a recognition of the subconscious and the unconscious and subjectivity. We were more aware of these things, and we said, okay, we need to apply some methodology to covering the news. So, one thing that came out of those very early days was like, let's have a byline. Who wrote the damn thing? Let's have datelines. Where were you? Were you actually there? Now it's come, quite a bit further. But in the poor execution of journalism in the 20th century, where you had white-dominated male newsrooms and the notion that the objective journalism is neutral, objectivity became mixed with, white male-dominated, and we worried about the subjectivity of people who weren't white males. Like, I'm worried about you because you're a woman of color, and like, could you cover this thing? So we have put ourselves in this position. But if I'd love to get rid of the term objectivity and replace it with something like open-minded inquiry or independent open-minded inquiry. To me, that's a better, more descriptive phrase, but it's describing the same thing that I think we all believe in. One last point that I make to young journalists, and people who have been in the business a long time know this: the most objective work, the work that reaches the highest standards in magazines, in investigative reporting, in long form books, is not neutral. You come to a point of view, right? And what the point of view of the author is. That's why the magazine piece was written. And the highest compliment you can give to a work like that is to say, I really liked your book. I loved it. I disagreed with your conclusion about this, and the other thing. That is like, I respect your reporting, and what I admire is the work you did, and I can even disagree with the point of view. So it really has nothing to do with being neutral.
That's really interesting. Go ahead.
Can I have a disagreement just a little bit with Tom? I think objectivity as a term and as we pursue it is more important today than ever before. There are people who want to bring in new terms, right? Wesley Lowery, who famously had a New York Times op-ed, said journalists need to have moral clarity. And the question was, well, but who's moral? Who's clarity? Professor Jay Rosen at NYU, who Tom has had conversations about this, right? And Jay has criticized at times Tom's book. He believes that journalists should now be pro-democratic, that they should pursue journalism, but as a pro-democracy pursuit of telling the truth. My concern is if we start giving into this idea that objectivity as a term, because it's been misunderstood, somehow has a PR problem. My concern is going to be that there will be other terms that are going to come into the sphere, but it's not going to be what we see as seeking truth and reporting, right? That's the ethics of SPJ. And there's a reason why we adhere to that, because truth, right? It's something that we journalists, we can verify, we can pursue, we can inquire, we can interview. And that's what we're good at. And to gain the public's trust, they need to know that there is an objective standard for journalists to tell them information that they need in order to have better informed society.
Okay, you're on the panel in the upcoming gathering for national. Just objectivity. Sara, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I take both of your points, Israel and Tom. Tom, I like this idea of open-minded inquiry. Because I still think objectivity has a big role to play. But again, I think what you said about the definition and what the definition has become is where things have gotten complicated. Because when I was, gosh, it's been a while, but when I was in school and sort of learning about journalism and ethics, it was that you were, they would say fair, but really it was like you couldn't take a side. You had to be always straight down the middle. And what would happen in 1930 when Hitler was, was in place, when that march of fascism was going strong and people were being massacred, are you going to be neutral then? Like, is that what we're going to do? And I think when you look back at the reporting in some of these instances, and even in our own, in the 20th century and 21st century, when you start looking at some of the reporting in what I will call the days of old, to shame us all, there are opinions being shared, or their opinion is probably too strong. There are sides being taken. The way in which a report has been told sometimes gives you a clue as to what the thought is of the person telling the story, or how we call it angles, like what angle, are you taking? And you can see that in things. Hurricanes that destroy people's homes are not considered good. And so it's quite interesting to go back and look. You talked about Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, when he was, on the anchor desk, and he showed emotion, obviously, when the president was shot, right? He took what do we all remember? The taking off of the glasses. And if you weren't born in that time, when you see that, it's still to this day when I see it, and I see him knowing how straight down the line and never kind of showing his emotions. I remember that and will remember that probably forever, just seeing that, and it was after it happened. And so I do worry about where we're going. There's a lot of talk about advocacy journalism. I've heard many different names: advocacy journalism, community journalism. And sometimes I'm not quite sure what that means, because isn't journalism just journalism, and then maybe there's other names for something else? I don't know. I'm still grappling with that. And I'd be really curious to know what both you and Israel, Tom, think about these new genres, if you will, of advocacy journalism and community. You'll hear like community journalism, what those mean to you, and if you think they're, good and useful. I grapple with it. I don't know sometimes what to make of it, because it kind of is what people want to hear. So if you're an advocate for something very specific, then that's the kind of journalism that you're looking at. But if the person takes the other side, then that's a major problem.
So before they're going to answer that,
Okay.
when you're, and hopefully quickly, because I want to get through. There's several questions that came in I want to ask, but please, both of you, I'll start with Tom. The advocacy journalism that we're seeing, that and the community-based, which has advocacy tendencies, is that the future? Or what can we do about this notion, whether you use objectivity or what you use? What do we do there?
Well, we've always had different genres of journalism, right? I mean, advocacy journalism is not a new term. It's not something that came up in the last 2 years. It goes back to the 50s and 60s. The progressive era, exposés. Most investigative journalism can be called prosecutorial journalism, where you're prosecuting a case. And opinion journalism, whether it's the National Review or the Nation. But we recognize the neighborhood we're in, and that's very different than two things that you see today. One, journalism that is advocacy and not independent. It's advocacy for a specific party. It's intermingled with the party. It's Sean Hannity advising the president and then reinforcing the messaging that he's doing with the president. That violates such a basic tenet of SPJ. And the other thing that you're seeing, which I think is new, is what I call journalism of affirmation, basically journalism that's trying to make a buck by reinforcing people's preconceptions, but describing itself as independent, fair, and balanced. So that's a dishonest presentation.
It's a lie, is what
it's
it
a
is.
lie, and that's very different than somebody says, look, we're the black press, or we're the left press, or we're this, and we're advocating, but our reporting is very thorough. I'll just finish this with one quick story, which is in Elements, so Israel knows this. Many years ago, the editor of an alternative weekly in Denver saying, I don't believe in objectivity, but at my paper, you can't have a point of view until you've explored all the other points of view. It's like, okay, well, that's my definition of objectivity, so we're good.
That's great. Israel, and Tom brought this up, and Sara, thank you for bringing it up, which is this ever-growing cluttered landscape that we're in with where do you know a journalist, who's a journalist? We'll talk about that in a second, but oftentimes what Tom, just to put a little flesh on that bone, oftentimes the new nonprofits that are coming out that are not affiliated with like INN are being funded directly by the parties. So it's even further. Israel, because you're the lawyer in the room here, obviously, we're talking about objectivity, and we're talking about, professional journalists and this agenda stuff. Does that concern you from a legal point of view?
From a legal point of view, I'm going to be a defender of the First Amendment. I'm going to be a defender of a free press. I'm going to be a defender of freedom of expression, right? So, for example, to answer one of the questions that one of our attendees asked, Nadine Jose asked the following: how does the proliferation of the internet alter the landscape of journalism as it pertains to navigating the First Amendment and truth? What is harm and who is culpable of that harm? And here's what I would say, right? We want more voices, right, in the marketplace of idea. We want as much information as possible because we believe that if we have a thriving marketplace of ideas, right, people are going to be informed and they're going to make decisions based on that information. So for me, I'm not so much concerned that you've got people on the right, people on the left who call themselves journalists, right? The National Review versus the Dispatch versus Politico versus The Hill. I'm not concerned about that. I think we need more voices, but we also need a very healthy news organization that stands in the middle, right? We've all seen that graphic of all the various news organizations that proliferate our society today, right? And we see that NPR stands right there in the middle. I'm proud to say CNN stands close to the middle as well. So to me, to not only answer Nadine's question, but to your point as well, am I concerned as a lawyer? No, because I want more speech, right? And I'm not so concerned that Fox is going to hurt.
Right.
I'm not concerned that Fox is going to hurt somehow the First Amendment or even the public, right? We have a new study that just came out this week. And this study looked at what happened when Fox viewers were asked to watch CNN. And I would urge all the viewers to go and look at that study, because the conclusion was that those viewers who tended to go to Fox News, when they watched CNN, they came back and they saw that they missed out on a lot of news. So to me, that was a good example that if we continue to push forward the idea that we want people, Fox viewers, yes, watch Fox, but please also watch CNN, watch MSNBC, read Paul Krugman, and read the Wall Street Journal. That's the push we need to make, not to lessen the voices, but to expand the voices.
Yeah, I don't want to bog down, but the one thing I would add as a caveat is as long as there's transparent information.
100%, right? That's ethics. Transparency is part of that ethics principle that we adhere. 100%.
So let's ask this. An anonymous attendee wrote, should CNN have stopped Chris Cuomo when he was having his show with his brother? Sara, you can pass. That's understandable. What do you think? Should Chris Cuomo have stopped with his show with his brother? Should he have not interviewed him and done anything with him? Should CNN?
So I think ultimately for many of us who worked in the field, we were very far away from it and sort of we were getting the news while everybody else was getting the news, basically. I do think that we have to, I will put it this way, we have to police ourselves. We cannot say that someone else can't do something or shouldn't do something, and then do it ourselves. I mean, we have to police ourselves, because otherwise, you know, we're putting ourselves in the position that we're higher or not having to follow the same rules as everyone else.
Thank you. I wanted, the next two questions are really kind of,
Can I just, Duane,
sure.
can I just,
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
just because I don't work for CNN, so I'm just going to say it was awful at the time. And CNN hurt its brand, or Zucker hurt CNN's brand by allowing that to happen. You didn't have to know about all the backroom stuff that was going on that we now know about to know. And he did it because they were good ratings, but it damaged CNN's brand. That does not mean it's an irrevocable thing, but it just added to the idea that, wow, once you reach about 8 o'clock at night on cable, it ain't news anymore.
Well, it also reinforced those who were opposed to the type of coverage that they thought CNN was about, and said, aha, there you go. That's really tough. The next questions are about social media, which I think is really important, and it's become a thing in all media. Is like, what are you portraying? And like, for instance, when I anchor, we're all happy. I'm an investigative reporter, but I know how it's seen, what I'm saying, and et cetera. But young reporters are using their social media to push agendas and products they buy while being while covering serious news. And reporters are being are allowing themselves to be seen having happy photos with politicians and et cetera. Does that qualify as ethical consideration for the reporter and journalism itself, and what the intent is to the audience? Is there an ethical breach there? Who wants to take that?
Sure, I'll take it. And again, let me talk more about SPJ than anything else, right? What does it mean to act independently, right? It is the highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism to serve the public. And how should we do that? Well, journalists do that by avoiding these conflicts of interest, by refusing gifts, going to dinners, taking pictures with these politicians that we're going to cover, right? Denying favored treatment to advertisers, distinguishing news from advertising at the local level. That's hard, right? Because sometimes the sales department wants you to go and do a story for a client. What do you do then, right? But I think, to me, when I look at that principle of ethical journalism, to act independently, independence, right, is understanding where we stand, right? We need people to call balls and strikes. That means that when we're behind the plate, when we are calling balls and strikes, we can't have a Yankees t-shirt underneath us secretly, right, calling the game. And to me, when I talk to young people, I say to them, be careful, because, gaining the trust is hard, but it can quickly go away.
Absolutely. There's another question. This came up earlier. Rebecca Aguilar had actually forwarded this question, and it came up from a member as well. Should TV stations be having fundraisers for the families of police officers killed in the line of duty when the accused has not gone through the court system? Is that not taking a side? Is it ethical? If I may, my reaction is I don't think taking care of the family of a police officer in the community is you can't compare that to taking the side of the person died, the officer died, and if they're doing something in the community to take care of that, I don't see it as where it should influence directly the coverage of an individual who's presumed innocent. But that's my first read. What are your thoughts there? Anyone want to take that?
Can I jump in and
Yeah.
can I jump in and just I want to talk about something that Israel said
Okay.
about pictures, because I I'm split on the pictures, and it is because we live now in a world where, especially those who are on social media all the time, taking a picture to someone who is a millennial or a Gen Zer is tantamount to drinking water. I mean, it is just, I was here, I was with this person. It doesn't mean that that you can't cover that person. There are a lot of times, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, I mean, is a room, full of muckety mucks and correspondents. And I don't feel like that line is crossed if you are able to objectively cover that person or whomever you are, taking pictures with. If they're in a position of power, if you are able to objectively cover that person, I wouldn't look at that picture myself and say, aha, that reporter is friends with, because the truth is, some people are friends with some of these folks, and sometimes contacts, you go to dinner with a contact, you sit down with them, it's very clear, you're not spending $1,000 hopefully, but you're spending 25, 50 bucks. And I always make clear, there's no quid pro quo here. Like, you want to tell me something? Okay, I'll go grab coffee with you. You know what I mean? So I think those lines can be very difficult, but I think they can be made clear when you are, if you are honest with the person and honest with the public.
Wayne, I'd like to weigh in on this really
Yeah.
fast.
Go ahead.
So I'm teaching a class at Maryland on the changing norms of journalism. And I asked the students in this class to write social media policies for a news organization that they've been running. They each run a different one all semester long. And most of these people who are, somewhere between 21 and 24, there are some master's students in there, said our first obligation is to telling the truth. I think it's okay for people to air their political views on social media if they feel strongly, but if it undermines their ability to credibly tell the truth, that's a problem. And if it gets in the way of their larger job. So there's a consciousness even among these, and basically we all know that if I live in San Francisco and I work for the Chronicle, it's okay for me to root for the Giants, but it's really not okay for me to root for the mayor. So I think people are able to make it, distinguish between sort of standing up for principles like equal justice under the law and backing an organization that really is a conflict of interest.
It's all really fascinating. There is an argument, by the way, that we're not connected enough with the government and with people in government, that we misunderstand what's going on. And sometimes it's helpful to have somebody who you do know who can, understanding there's a spin likely, but at least somebody that's a touch point to get to where you need to go. So the idea of unhooking and saying I can't go anywhere and talk to anybody, I think sometimes can be overdone. I want to take it a little bit different route here. So I'm going to give you a story about ethical challenge from within. When I was covering corruption in Cleveland, and that involved the mob as well, a couple of decades ago, I was offered a job for $250,000 from the auditor who was at the center of my investigation over the shifting of values for rich friends. We had compiled an amazing amount of material that also showed that there was a huge amount of corruption that was centered on the properties themselves. So he offered me the job and I turned him down with a lot of expletives saying, that's not your effing money. That's taxpayer stuff. And my only regret was I couldn't grab the recorder at the time quickly enough to get him. He ended up spending money on advertising in a non-election year. And I was called into the general manager's office at the time and told that I was done with investigating this story. And that general manager, thankfully, years later, called to apologize for that. But there was a quid pro quo that happens. This happens because we operate in businesses. And I'm not asking you to talk about your current employment, please don't. But have you faced a realization, the challenge, where you see that the ethics of what you bring to the table, because we're really idealists. We believe there are many people that share our ethical underpinnings, and the world just isn't made that way in large part. Have you been faced that crisis yourself? I could go on with other stories. I'm done with it. But have you faced it, Sarah? Have you faced it along your career? You've been in LA,
Absolutely.
other markets as well.
Absolutely. So I started off my career, I did about 15 years, I think, in local news. And by the way, enjoyed every minute of it, except for the early days when I was making less than minimum wage. But anyway, it's a long story, which is another problem that we'll talk about at another time. But I had a situation in one of the stations in which I worked in local news, where we were doing a story on a local car dealership. Now, as you know, the car dealers and car companies are the biggest advertisers generally in local news, or at least one of the biggest advertisers. And there came a point at which it was a consumer investigative case. We were explaining that they were basically trying to trick people into a financially unsound decision using paperwork and poor language, and it was scheming, and it was targeting particularly low-income people who weren't being given the truth when they were signing onto some of the documents to get the car. And it was complicated, but we got to the bottom of it. And in the end, initially my story was spiked because of course we had to call the dealerships, there was more than one doing this. And the story was initially spiked, and then I walked out. I got so upset. I left that day when I heard that it wasn't going to air. I walked out and I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure what to do. I'm like, do you quit in protest? Maybe. Do you stay and fight and see what you can get on the air? Maybe. Or do you just take it and go to the next story and be like, well, I lost one. And what I decided to do was stay and fight to get it on the air. And so we did eventually get the story on the air. I didn't feel it was as strong as it could have been. It still got the point across. And so it was a really difficult time in my career, because I was very aware of what happened with 60 Minutes and the cigarette maker. And I was hyper aware of that, especially doing consumer investigative and any kind of investigative work. And it was hard for me. I had a really rough time for several months. I was really bitter, I guess is the word to use. But we did end up getting the story on the air. We did end up getting some people's money back. And in the end, I thought, well, at least there was some cure for someone. It wasn't the story I wanted to do, but it was the story I could get on. And I'd be curious to know what you, Israel and Tom, think about that, because I could have just said, this was before social media was really big, where, someone will go on and just blast their station. I don't know if that's a great idea. But I never forgot it. I'll put it that way. Of all the things I've done, I've never forgot the way I felt the day when they said the story wasn't going to initially.
Mm-hmm.
Israel, you want to go?
Yeah, but just let me say this, Sarah, I had tremendous respect for you coming into tonight, and wow, I tip my hat to you. That is true journalism right there. And it comes across, by the way, on air, that you are a fighter, and I'm so damn proud that you're there as a journalist still, that nobody kicked you out of the business and nobody told you that your love doesn't matter. Your love for journalism and the truth doesn't matter. So thank you.
She didn't
Thank you
get
for
fired
sharing.
or sidetracked. The point is,
No, she got promoted. You know what? The universe was kind to her. The arc of justice, right, goes back to her.
And I will point out the universe isn't always kind and just.
It isn't always kind, but I will admit to something, and it wasn't because of this, but years later, I did leave the business for a little while. That was just one small, sort of small, I guess it wasn't that small, I'm still talking about it, but it was just one thing in a series of things that made me leave for a few months and then realize, you know what, I really miss the job. I miss the interviewing. I miss the storytelling. I miss the writing. I miss journalism. And I came back, and here I am.
Duane, I would just say that it's very important that you have idealists in newsrooms, because they are part of the culture of these organizations. And even if you've got pretty cynical people at the top, they've got to navigate all those goddamn idealists who fill up the newsroom. And so it's really important that we come in feeling this way. And I'm sure most of the people listening to this webinar have some story like this. Often it does involve car dealers, mine does. And and the first time that happens, you walk around the block and you talk to people and you're really, and you never really become inured to it. You learn how to navigate it. But it's really important that the guy up there in that glass office is thinking, how am I going to explain this to all those stupid idealists that I also have to deal with every day?
Well, I'll come back, I'll put a bow tie. My investigation was sidelined for a bit, but I tried to give my documents over to other journalists in town, couldn't give them over. And there was an ethic moment where the FBI asked for information, which was before they did a raid, and the people I covered went to federal prison. So I ended up covering the stuff that I was doing, but I covered it with privilege because it was a court case now. The point is that, and I just want to point out too, journalists suck as business people. We just, for all the reasons we're so good at what we do, we do need, it's a symbiotic relationship and it's very difficult. I'm not casting stones, but it's tough.
And the other thing I would say, and I know we need to move on to other things, but facts are stubborn things. And so, the GM goes, they come and go, but those facts are like uranium and they are on our side.
Absolutely. That's a good point. There wasn't a question.
Duane, can I tell my story? Do you mind?
Sure. If you quit,
just
yes.
because I know and the reason for it is because mine is very public. It's been covered by the Washington Post. It's been covered by the New Yorker. But I worked for a Sinclair station in 2016. We were covering the Trump campaign in Florida. Trump and Hillary Clinton were coming through. And there was an instance where questions to be asked of the candidate came down from corporate headquarters. And I was given the questions. You're going to go interview Trump at 5 o'clock in Boynton Beach. And here are the questions. And I looked at the questions and I said, these aren't coming from, objective journalists. These are coming from the campaign. And I said, I'm not interviewing, right? I'll interview. I'll be born happy, but I'm not going to ask any of these questions. And as punishment, they sent me from West Palm Beach to Tampa to cover Trump, who was going to have a rally at 9 o'clock at night. I had to do a live shot in Tampa. If anybody knows Florida, that's a 3-hour drive. They didn't put me up in a hotel. And what I tell that story is, sometimes you would think, right? Oh, I want to get that picture covering Trump because it's going to look good on my social media campaign. Look at me, I'm covering this candidate. But on that day, on that time, it was more important to say, again, like Tom, like Sara, like you, right? Ethics matters. This is against my morals, and I'm not going to do this. And again, the Washington Post, the New Yorker have covered this, but to the larger extent, I would tell all young journalists, there's going to be a time where you're going to have to say no. Be brave, and whatever happens, happens, but you can stand tall saying, I did the right thing.
Well, there is a personal brand of journalism that's at stake for all of us, and that's important to know. And for clarification and transparency, I work at a Sinclair shop. I also do Spotlight on America through Sinclair. And the weirdest part is I've had none of that, even though I'm aware of these stories, none of that has ever gotten to me, which is, I don't know why, but that's my reality. They let me do my thing. I don't, we're in different areas. I don't know why.
Good for you.
Awesome. Let me ask about the idea of separation. There are a lot of people asking, like, are influencer journalists like Taylor Lawrence, the future of journalism? We don't know what the future is, but one of the things I want to point out is it seems to me that right here, right now, we have really smart people gathered who care deeply about journalism and what it's about. So I want to kind of focus us on one thing toward the end here is we have to, at some point, reestablish the trust of journalism with all of the noise. And one of the thoughts that I always come back to is and Tom will weigh in on this strongly, I hope, is not a board or whatever, but standards. What do we represent as journalists? How can we codify journalism that stands out from all the people who are pretending to be journalists? I guess since I brought your name up, Tom, I want you to start that. And it's not, again, I know it's not an easy answer, but is there a way to separate the quote unquote journalist in a way that becomes professional rather than a trade, which is creating some of the confusion? The questions I get all the time are, I don't know who to believe.
Right.
And so how do we separate?
So, well, actually, and it goes to Eleanor's question about influencers. So there are influencers who, get paid to peddle products and promote them in social media, and that's not journalism. That's a new form of advertising. There are also influencers, I would say, and maybe this is a stretch of the term, who produce great journalism and have Substacks, and people follow that journalist because they admire the way they work. The journalists talk about the way they do things. The Daily, that podcast at the New York Times, which goes behind the story and humanizes journalists and the storytelling that they do. I think a big part of journalism in the future is going to be, I'm not sure I trust this institution, but I like these 4 or 5 people. That already happens in particularly areas where point of view really matters. Like there are some baseball writers who I follow avidly on Twitter because I think they're really good. And whether I read their publications or not, I read them. And I think that's a virtuous part of journalism. I mean, I admire Sara. I admire her more now than I did before the night began. And that makes me respect journalism more, but it's her individual story. CNN's a complex place. I've got some issues with some things that go on there, but I really like, but it's a pure, clearer thing to admire a person and the way they work.
Right. And who wants to go next? Anybody want to weigh in?
Thank you. And Israel, thank you. I don't think I deserve the praise, but I do like seeing, I like it when someone says, listen, I'm liberal, I'm from the far left or whatever, however they want to describe themselves. And here is who I am, and here is what I'm doing. And then then they talk to someone. I can't remember the name right now. It's come out of my head, but I've seen someone do this where the first thing they start off saying is they tell you where they're coming from. And then they ask someone who is not, of their same beliefs, what they think. And it is kind of an interesting way to engage the audience. And I don't dislike that. I know some independent journalists that are wonderful. I will mention January 6th. If you look on any network across the board at the most compelling video, with probably the exception of the New York Times, who had someone going into the building with a camera at the time it was all happening. But most of the video that you will see that has been used by, in the hearings, that has been used by the FBI, that has been used by journalists to figure out who was there, is from live streamers. And what their role is pretty incredible. They've come up and started doing this all over the country. I mean, I know they are coming now together as groups, deciding who goes where, almost like, like a news organization that is in the mainstream. And I think they've really added to the conversation. There are, of course, ethical issues sometimes, but they tend to stay quiet or, sort of send things out and say a few words, but most of it is just raw video. And I think they have changed the game in some ways of how to inform the public about a very specific thing happening, usually something that is that involves conflict.
Israel, I want you to answer Rebecca's question, which is you didn't say what the outcome of your back in the 2017. Did you quit? Were you fired? What happened?
Yeah, well, no. So that was in October of 2016. And as I told the New Yorker, I had privilege because I knew that I was going to be leaving the station after my after the November book, because my contract was coming to an end. And I knew that I had a choice. I had just become a new dad. I had a 2-year-old. I became a father later in life. So I had a choice. I could become the evening news anchor at another TV station, but miss a lot of volleyball games, soccer games, or I can go and teach. And I had an offer to teach, and I would have my summers off to go be able to take an 8-year-old to go to the Grand Canyon. And so to me, again, right, we started this conversation, morals and ethics. To me, I was able to say no to Sinclair because I knew that I was about to leave, right? But I can understand other people who don't have that ability. It's hard. It's a tough choice. And you have to do what works best for you, your family, your career. But in the end, right, I was able to tell others what happened. And we were able to hold Sinclair accountable. And I think there have been changes made over the last few years. If you look at programming from WJLA in DC, good reporting, good station. But that's because internal journalists are saying we got to do better.
Yeah, that's good.
Can I answer Vivian's question or touch
Absolutely.
on Vivian's question?
Yes.
Question about she's got Russian anti-war Russians who would like her to use their name, and she's trying to weigh the pros and cons. So I would say the SPJ ethics are sort of like the Bill of Rights. And sometimes those rights are conflicting. So in this instance, transparency about your sources would say if someone is willing to be named, you should name them. But do no harm also says you don't want to harm the people you're writing about. So I think basically she should use her best judgment. And if she thinks, I respect their courage, but I believe that the harm will be done, that the harm will outweigh the good. And by the way, in this instance, she can tell the story and it's just as powerful without their names. And no one's going to think, well, I doubt this is true. These people, I don't, who are these anonymous sources? She has the ability to tell that story and protect those sources. And that's where I would come down on that, because do no harm is as important a principle as transparency.
It's a tough one, though. That is a tough one. We're late, so I want to do one last one. I thank you all so much. With everything happening, and Israel brought this up, so he will hold me accountable as a board member. There are a lot of people being hired by networks and by predominantly networks, let's stay on the TV side, as quote unquote consultants or experts or contributors is another term. The most recent one is at CBS hiring one of the Trump administration's
Mick Mulvaney.
So that and they explained it as that will give them access to avenues they didn't have before, et cetera, et cetera. I think, Israel, your point is it violates an ethical approach to news. Is that your point, or I'll let you make it?
That's one, right? Here's the post that I made in advertising this conversation, and I said, look, the head of CBS News argues that hiring Mick Mulvaney will give the news organization access to the corridors of power because he anticipates that the GOP is going to take over Capitol Hill in the fall and perhaps maybe the White House 2 years from now, right? So he thinks his audience will be served by that kind of access. However, as I pointed out, the SPJ Code of Ethics says the highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. So how does hiring Mick Mulvaney serve the public when the public deserves the truth, right? They're not going to get the truth from Nick. He's going to go and he's going to talk to his friends. His friends are going to tell him spin. He's going to come back to CBS This Morning. He's going to go on whatever show they have, and he's going to give spin. There's a big difference between him and hiring a, William Safire. We're old. We all know who William Safire is, but he was a guy who worked the White House in the Nixon administration, and then he became a columnist for the New York Times. But William kept reporting. He was reporting, and he was holding his side accountable. Mick Mulvaney is not going to be the kind of person that the audience will be able to go, oh, okay, he's balancing the equities. He's giving me some truth. He's going to provide spin. And so to me, the argument is using the ethics. And again, not opinion. I don't care about his politics. I'm not anti-Trump or pro-Trump. What I'm saying is I'm using the ethics to say, does this serve the public? And I would argue it does not, because he's not going to provide the information that has value to the audience.
How does that differ from George Stephanopoulos, from Jenna Bush? I mean, there's a long litany of
100%.
people who have access. So do you want to weigh in, Sara, on that?
Yes. I mean, so if you look at what, for example, you mentioned Jenna Bush and George Stephanopoulos, and I think George Stephanopoulos has moved into, and for many, many, many years, to be fair, and is asking the tough questions of whomever, right, he's sitting in front of. The morning shows are, I think they're considered very differently than news shows, network morning news for the most part. In that you'll notice the segments are, very, very, they can be lighter. It's everything from cooking to mom makeovers to best deals of the day. And so I sometimes wonder if there's a blurring of the lines in the morning, because they do a news segment and they talk about the big stories of the day, and then they move into something very different. And I think that's always kind of been there, and it's confusing, I think, to a lot of us. And I think the public is, it's weird. If they like the person, then you hear less about it. If the person's less controversial, that you hear less about it. I think a lot of journalists do see those hires sometimes and think, what is going on, right? Because that is also, just from a personal standpoint, a job that a journalist would naturally want to go into. And when they feel like there's no real path there because they don't have access to certain power, nobody's going to have better access to, a former president than the daughter of a former president. Nobody's going to have, better access to someone who is in the inner circle. So I think that I think it all depends on how the person performs once in the position that they are in.
Yeah, thank you. And Tom, does it blur the lines when we do this activity? Do you see a blurring of what we're doing? Especially, I know you've come from the print side, so you have, a background of understanding the written word and the basis for it. But in TV, when you watch this and the head shake, is this a head shake moment where the lines blur from a TV point of view?
I think there's two things. One is the blurring of who's a journalist and who's a whatever. In those panels where journalists are indistinguishable from political spinners and consultants, that's a problem. Most of what people think of as journalism is what they see on TV. And if so, a lot of that is not journalism, that's harming the whole profession. Makes what SBJ tries to do a lot harder. The other thing is, I think there's a difference between, getting a conservative and getting a conservative who is proven to be sort of anti-press and maybe a dishonest spinner. There is spin and there is spin. There's political advocacy and then there's something else. And so there's a lot of choices they could make here. And I think that's part of the issue. The issue is not, should we have thoughtful conservative voices, and even pro-Trump, very, very much part of the new base of the Republican Party. There are people you can have who are insightful, Some people are going to object simply because they don't want conservatives on the air, but that's a different issue. I'd put Jenna Bush, by the way, in a different category. She was the daughter of a president. She wasn't, she
Right.
wasn't. The other thing I just say really quickly, the old view on this was you can go through the doorway once, but you shouldn't go back and forth over and over and over. He's not there to be a journalist, but you really, that's just that notion like, well, he's not a journalist, he's this other thing. The audience doesn't make those distinctions very well. And that's dishonest on the part of the news organization to say, well, that person, we're going to pay them money, but they operate by entirely different standards. They can be a liar. They can believe in alternative facts or whatever. That's cool.
I just think this is a really, really cool thing. I know we're very late, so I want to give a wrap to this, if I may, to allow you to get on with your nights. Just in terms of this, very quick, do you have optimism about the future? Do you think we will, because we've been in turmoil, will we eventually get this right? Will journalism, which has been under such attack and business models falling apart, the demise of local papers, I could go on and on. I'm a good hand wringer about these things. But will we find a way to get this right? After all, what is at stake is democracy itself. It relies on a free and independent journalist to check government. Sara, are we going to get this right?
I think many people are getting it right and have gotten it right for a very long time. But the public and the way that things have gone, and that is not just on the public, it's certainly, we play a role in that. But I do think there's so much some of the most incredible reporting that we have seen in this millennium has happened in these past few years. And I'm speaking much of the New York Times and the Washington Post and some of the things that they have uncovered. It's remarkable what has happened. So I, by no means is, for example, journalism dead. You'll hear that from people who are cynical. I think we have a lot of mending to do to gain, again, the public's trust. And like you said, you can lose it real quick. I think there is some mending to do, but I have a lot of hope. I go back to my university. I go to other universities, IU, University of Florida, and I talk to students, and I got to tell you, those guys and girls are way smarter and way more engaged than I was when it's shocking to me how much they know about investigations and they have the best ideas. I'm so impressed when I talk to young journalists, young people who want to get into the business. So I think we have work to do, but I do think we have a good group of human beings that really are engaged.
Thank you. Israel, are you optimistic? And again, to the point, we have great journalists, but we have a lot of problems with tens of thousands of journalists being jettisoned in the new realities. Are we going to get this right?
Sure. Let me show you something. I was a cheerleader in high school. This is me in high school. All right. I was a cheerleader. That's me right there. That's 18-year-old Izzy. All right. So let me be a cheerleader again, because I get to work at Elon University. I'm a journalism professor. I teach media law and ethics. I have a cool job, right? And I get to see the next generation of rising journalists. And Sara is absolutely right. Despite 5 years of attacks, heavy attacks on journalists, despite what happened on January 6th, democracy survived. Journalists did their jobs. We stood firm, and students are coming into the program. They want to do it after they've seen what Sara and what Tom's students and what you, Duane, have faced. That tells me that we have fearless people, right? They're going to stand on the shoulders of giants. So to me, I get excited when I see these students, Tom's students, Sara's mentees, the next generation. So yeah, I'm very optimistic, right? But that's why SPJ exists, to be the cheerleader, to say the First Amendment matters, and what you do it ethically.
Tom.
Well, I'm not showing a picture of me in high school because my hair was twice as long as Sara's. And it was curly. It went up over the screen. Clayton Christensen, the innovation, the kind of thinker about innovation and digital disruption, created the term jobs to be done. What jobs to be done are there that people need? And I think the future depends on whether having credible information that that you can act on, and that civic society can create compromises around. If that's a job to be done that people require, that citizens want in their lives, then journalism will be fine.
That's awesome. And just a lesson from the past, it was a long time ago, but we went through yellow journalism. We went through all various phases of getting it wrong as much as we got it right back when. I share your optimism. I'm helping with a lot of universities as well. I think these young men and women are fantastic. So I wanted to end it on a good note, but that requires all of us to dedicate ourselves to the principle of this fairness. We won't use objectivity because that'll be a panel. We are going to go after truth, be transparent, and be fair. I am awfully honored by all of you. You have nothing but my respect, and anytime you want to help with SPJ, please do so. And we have a lot of people who can benefit from your knowledge. Thank you so much. Anything you want to say in the end? Everybody just want to give a thumbs up and say thank you.
Thanks, Duane.
Duane, Israel, Tom, I've learned some things I'm going to take back and write down because my memory isn't as good as it used to be. Thank you. It really, sometimes I need this. I need to hear from my colleagues and who are enthusiastic, but have some really deep concerns. It's really, really helpful to have these conversations. And SPJ, by the way, I do check your website sometimes when I have questions about things that come up. So, so thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And we'll be
By the
watching.
way, wait, real quick. Sara, plug your show. CNN
No,
Plus,
that's right,
news streaming service. Come on, plug your show.
You see, we're terrible at business. You're absolutely right.
It's from the cheerleader. We need to. He's going to show the picture.
Plug your business. CNN Plus, streaming now.
I'm doing something new. It's new to me. You know, a lot of people watch streaming stuff. We started a streaming program first time that CNN's ever done it. And I have a show called Big Picture. And what we do on that show is to try and take one subject and delve deeper into it. It's about a half an hour. We bring in guests, we bring in experts, we bring in reporters, and try to delve deeper into it. The last one we did this week, they are all streaming, so you don't have to watch them live, but it is live at 9 a.m. And then you can watch the streaming. The last one we did was about propaganda, which fits into all of this. And so I'd love for you to check it out at cnnplus.com.
That's on the streaming service, CNN Plus. We got the plug-in. I believe.
And buy this novel right here over my head. The Days to Come. It's a political thriller. If we're plugging stuff, I'm plugging that.
The Days to Come. Tom Rosenstiel, the author, the latest book, and Israel will show his cheerleading picture no more. So thank you very much, folks. I really appreciate it. Oh, I don't know what
my daughter.
Is. Oh, lovely.
That's my daughter. I'm plugging my daughter. I don't have any books, so I'll plug my artistic daughter. There you go.
That's plug of all. Folks, thank you. God bless. Stay safe. And we will be paying attention to all of you. Thank you so much.
Bye. Good night.
Bye-bye. Night.